Hi, welcome to World History by a Jew. I'm your host, Seth Fleishman. We are starting a two-part series on King Tut and the Hebrews. We'll be delving deeply into ancient Egypt's New Kingdom. And let's look at our timeline here. Those of you who have heard all the lectures know we started with the Old Kingdom, both the pre-dynastic period and then moving on to the first few dynasties. And that's where we talked about the pyramids being built. And then, so that was lectures 1 and 2. Then number 3, we covered the Middle Kingdom, the Hyksos, the coming of the Semites and of Abraham. Lecture 4, our last lecture was on Joseph and Thutmose the Third and really the founding of the New Kingdom, the founding of Dynasty 18. After that, we've now entered King Tut and the Hebrews. So number 5 will actually be 2 parts. The first one we'll do tonight, and the next one will be in a week or so. The last part is the Exodus, which actually has already been recorded. Those of you who've been to a few of these lectures know that. Due to Passover, I did that one first. But be sure to check that out after you get the 2-part series on number 5 here, if you haven't seen it already. Now, looking at our timeline, we've gone, first of all, if you look on the left, you'll see the rabbinical timeline. These are the dates that we've been working with. And like I've said many times, it's not exact when you're matching Jewish dates and the archaeological dates, but the way our chronology has been working, it's really close. And so right here we have a timeline to compare our Jewish dates with, and these are the pharaohs we've been covering. So a couple lectures ago we mentioned Ahmose. Last lecture we talked about Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Tonight, and we briefed on Amenhotep II. We're going to talk about him again tonight, and then we're going to run all the way up to Akhenaten. Now with our Jewish dating, you'll see we covered Abraham. We're finished off Joseph, so we're entering this gray area, or I guess it's light blue, but this area in between Joseph and Moses. So when we get to Exodus, we'll be starting off with Moses. And in the other major events besides the pharaohs and the patriarchs can be seen here in the middle. So the Hyksos was in expulsion of the Hyksos. This was the Abraham lecture. We've talked about the brick making already. We're actually going to be covering this Upper L. May not be familiar to you, but we'll be covering that in our next lecture. And then this first mention of Israel and Canaan, you'll see in the Exodus lecture. All right, so let's really get started tonight here. That's your preview. That's catching up with the chronology. So let's get started. And I want to start off with what most people would say is the most astounding archaeological discovery ever, and that's King Tut's tomb. So many stories had to come together for this discovery. And it's these pictures I'm sure you've seen before. Now, you may have seen them in black and white, and I think the Griffith Institute, which is actually part of the University of Oxford, but the Griffith Institute has done a wonderful job of colorizing. It brings new pop to the pictures if you haven't seen them before. But let's talk about some of these stories that came together to bring us the discovery of King Tut's tomb. The first, there's actually been another one since, but definitely the most famous and certainly the first of the untouched, pristine tombs of a pharaoh. Now, first of all, let's talk about Howard Carter. Howard Carter was from a long line of artists, and he actually got the job because when he would accompany his father, and his father would go paint some wealthy people in Britain, and he'd accompany his father, and one of those patrons happened to be a collector of ancient artifacts, and Howard would sit there and draw these artifacts, and he got really good at it, his father's artistic talent. And so when he was a young man, these same wealthy circle of people were looking for an artist to go to Egypt and maybe be a little bit cheaper and a little less demanding than the aristocratic artists. So Howard Carter was invited to go. So he heads to Egypt, And who does he end up working for? None other than Flinders Petrie. Flinders Petrie is my favorite Egyptologist. He's made an appearance, or at least a mention, in every one of these lectures. And he is he's the one who really takes Howard Carter from being this young artist to being an archaeologist in his own right. And so that's Howard Carter. Okay, and by the way, Howard Carter kind of moved up. He was going through the ranks there, and there's, like I said, there's so many side stories, but there was an incident where a French tourist had a little scuffle with a native Egyptian, and Howard Carter came out on the side of the native Egyptian, which was just unheard of in the colonial era. And he actually got fired for representing the right side, for representing this native over this colonial representative. And so he gets fired, he didn't have a job. Now let's take Lord Carnarvon, who is the sponsor, but is very important to our story. He was a lord in Great Britain, as you can tell. He actually had one of the very first automobiles in England. And some say he had the very first automobile accident in England as well. He would be injured. This is obviously long before seatbelts. And what does he do in his recovery time? Well, he wants some dry air and something, get outside of England. And he ends up going to Egypt and falls in love with archaeology. So he would end up going back to England after he recovers, but he's going to become the sponsor of archaeological digs. And he would be the one to hire Howard Carter, who was out of work from his incident with that Frenchman. He was out of his work, so Carnarvon hires him to do this dig. So for 4 years, and there was a lot of detective work on the part of Howard Carter, but for 4 years, he's digging in this area that he's very sure could be where King Tut is buried. And they're starting the 5th year, and Carnarvon just says, listen, it's been 4 years of sponsorship. We haven't found anything. And Howard Carter tells them, just give me 1 more year. In fact, I'll pay for it. I'll sponsor it. Just give me 1 more year. And Lord Carnarvon knows that Howard Carter can't afford it, but he understands the importance to Carter when he says that. So Carnarvon gives him 1 more year. And right after they start on the 5th year, on the 4th of November, 1922, a water boy, just bringing up water for the dig, one of the many laborers on site, stumbles on a block. And when they look down to look at this block that he stumbles on, and they realize it's a stair, and they dig it out, and there's another stair, and they dig it out, and there's another stair. And they keep digging it out till they're all the way down, and there's an entranceway. At this point, Howard calls Lord Carnarvon and tells him he's got to get there. He's got to get to Egypt. They found something. So Carnarvon, as you can see from the dates here, it takes Carnarvon a little bit of time, but he shows up on November 26th, and they drill a little peephole into the doorway, and Howard Carter shines a candle into this, through this peephole, and you have one of the famous, maybe the most famous line in archaeology, when Lord Carnarvon says, Howard, can you see anything? And Howard responds, yes, wonderful things. And what he was seeing was actually the glint off of these artifacts here. So he's seeing these gilded statues and really furniture, and that's the shine that he was seeing from his candlelight. So anyway, they open up the tomb, and they go from room to room. And what they quickly realized that this tomb had never been looted in antiquity. A lot of that has to do with the fact that King Tut's name was completely erased. So as I've said many a times in Egyptology, one of the most amazing, just so amazing, that they take this language no one can read. They take a language that's written in a language no one can speak, that then has been erased over and over again by successive rulers, and they're still able to put together a cohesive story. It's really just an amazing human achievement. So because of that erasure of successor pharaohs, King Tut was largely able to remain unknown. And so we get this great discovery. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a closer look here. Inside the coffin, it's just imagine 250 pounds of solid gold coffin. And if that's not enough, within there is the most famous of all the artifacts of King Tut, and that's the death mask, which is what you have right here. The death mask is, I mean, just an amazing piece of art. And I took this picture intentionally. There's something about that, I don't even know who Roland Ugger is, but this picture he took, I think, is wonderful. It really, it brings out the beauty of the artifact. If you're wondering, this picture right here is of King Tut and his wife. We're going to get more into that in the next lecture, but this is actually a piece of King Tut's throne that you're looking at. So this is artwork from King Tut's throne. Next up, let's take a closer look of the tomb that Howard Carter discovered. This right here is the doorway. So this is the stairwell. Remember I said the water boy tripped over a stair. So here's the stair that he tripped over. And when they dug it out, this is the door that Carter came to. And then he called his sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, and told him to come here. And this is where the little peephole was cut. And he shines the candle in. And you can see these artifacts, you remember from the previous screen. This is what that shine was that he was seeing. And there would be some political controversies that slowed things down, but by February, Carter was in the main tomb. So here you see where the main tomb was, and you see where the coffin was, the 250-pound golden coffin, and you can see the treasure room. Really amazing stuff. But so that was the discovery of King Tut. And now what I want to do is bring us up to King Tut. How do we get to King Tut? So let's get back to our chronology. These two maps are the main maps you should be aware of for tonight. I'm actually going to come back to it later. Both maps I know say it's for the Hittites, but I want these are the two best maps I could find showing the countries in both of Egypt during the New Kingdom, but also the surrounding nations as well. So you have the Egyptian Empire. We're going to be talking a lot about the Hittites tonight and Mitanni. We'll get to Babylonia a little bit later on, but just kind of, you will take a mental note of the slide before we move on. Now, in our next slide, we're going to have a slight rehash of our last lecture because I touched on two pharaohs, but we need to bring them back because they're both going to be very relevant to tonight. So these are the last two pharaohs that I mentioned quickly at the end of the last lecture, and now we're going to talk about them again tonight, but only in terms of how they connect to tonight's lecture. Okay, so to remind you, Amenhotep II, he was this great athlete, right? The story goes, he claims he could fire an arrow through 3 inches of solid copper. He claims he was such a good rower that he could row by himself. He could row faster than 200 of his naval men going up against him. He claimed to also be a great runner. The guy was athletic, clearly was athletic based on how much he talks about. Now, whether he could fire an arrow through 3 inches of solid copper or 200 solid copper, I don't think any of us are counting. But I don't want to talk about him as the athlete. What I want to do is mention that this last line is going to have a lot of relation to us tonight, and this is that he probably created the first image of the Aten. And what's the Aten? The Aten is this image right here. So it's the sun with these rays and these little hands at the end of the rays. So we're going to be coming back to the Aten both this lecture and the next one. I just want you to know it started with Amenhotep II. And then his successor, who was the son of a secondary wife, and he was the one I talked about last time, how he left us this great treasure by taking the Sphinx and digging out of the sand and reconditioning it and making it last all the way up into our era, where there'd be a handoff in the modern era to give it another reconditioning. So he left us this great treasure. His relevance to us tonight is not really him, it's who his son was. And his son is really our star pharaoh of the show tonight. So let's get to it. Let's get to his son. Amenhotep III is widely considered to be the best pharaoh, period. from whatever source you want to pull from, most would, if they picked a number one, would pick him a number one. What's amazing about him is he never fought a military campaign. Like, he never had to invade another country. There was a minor skirmish that he handled in Kush, but really the guy did this accomplished this, has this reputation without ever being a warrior king. And he did this by being a great diplomat. So who was he? He was the son of Thutmose IV, but not from the great wife of Thutmose IV. He was from a secondary wife. However, it seems that he was tapped to be his father's successor while his father was still alive. That would be an excellent indication that the guy was showing some unusual abilities. Typically, there would be this big bottleneck of the sons of the secondary wives, and how does one stand above the other? Clearly, he was a head above his brothers and his half brothers in his father's lifetime. So he was tapped to rule. He'd end up ruling well over 30 years. He was he was only 12 years old when he took over. His mother was probably a regent for a few years. But nonetheless, he's going to rule for over 30 years and leave a lasting impact on the Egyptians, and really leaving us a legacy even to this day, which we're going to get to. Also, we're going to talk about mummification in a minute, because this is really the peak of mummification in ancient Egypt. Now, Amenhotep III was Egypt's greatest royal builder. All right, more statues were built of him than any other king. But the name was often changed. So the best example is his number one fam. So when Ramses II became Pharaoh, the Pharaoh he wanted to emulate was Amenhotep III. That was like the guy, like you want to be like him. And so Ramses II loved him so much, he started copying the guy's, taking the guy's statues and scratching out Amenhotep's name, and Ramses II was putting his own name to take credit for it. Also, I should mention the Colosseum of Memnon. This scene right here is probably familiar to y'all. I intentionally chose a picture that has the people in it so you can see how big they are. Unfortunately, they're not in great shape anymore, but you can at least appreciate what they must have looked like in its prime. There was actually at least even one bigger statue. That was a quartzite statue. It would have been over 70 feet tall, but all we have left are the feet. The advantage of studying art history in Egypt is they were incredibly consistent. They had a set dimensions for everything. And so if you just have the feet of a statue, you know exactly how tall that statue was. I'm sure it would have been impressive. And since I have twins, I must also mention that his two greatest builders were twins. And again, I always like when these kings give credit to the people under them. You don't see that a lot of times. Even in business, you see a lot of times the boss takes credit for everything. So it's always like when I see these pharaohs give credit for talented people. So his two greatest builders were these two twins named Sudi and Kor. Now, let's talk about his building, because it's not so much a tour of the statues, but a tour of the building. So we're going to run through a couple different examples of his building projects. So let's start with the Avenue of the Sphinxes in Luxor. So and we'll get to it a little bit more to explain what's going on here, but the short version is you already have Karnak, and he starts this big project in Luxor. They're about 1.5 miles, 2 miles apart. So he builds this roadway to connect these two complexes. And all along the roadway, he builds these sphinxes, and you can see a picture of it right here. So here's the Sphinx. You see how many there must be over the entire length of this walkway. And then if you look, what I wanted to do here is there's this great website by Mark Milmore, and here, you can see the information here, so feel free to look it up. The guy gets all the credit in the world for this. I just borrowed his work because I want to show you. But you see, first of all, that the statues were painted. The walls are going to be, you can see, are painted. We see both when you look at be it Greek or Roman or Egyptian, we just see the color of the stone. That's not the way it was in the ancient world. They did paint these statues. They did paint their buildings. It wasn't just natural stone, but that ink's worn out. You can find, archaeologists can find traces of it in little nooks and crannies. And it allows them to get a good idea of what it looked like when it was fully painted. So anyway, so I wanted to compare. So here's your Avenue of the Sphinxes, the way it is today. That gives you an idea of what it would have looked like in Amenhotep III's time. And then here's just one of the individual ones. Now what I want to show you is we're going to actually zoom back, and I want you to get an overall picture. Okay, so again, work of Mark Milmore. And if you look, this, you see this is this picture. It's almost exactly this picture. If you look, you have your painted sphinxes here. Here's your walkway here. This statue you see is here. The obelisk you see right here. You can see right here. And then you have the wall here to the temple, and there's your wall. So that's a great example of what this complex would look like to the ancients versus what we're seeing today. So this is a lot of fun. So I decided I'm going to do one more of these. So let's take a look actually at the temple court that Amenhotep built. So this is the Luxor temple court. And right now you're just looking at these columns. So what's the big deal about these columns? Well, what's unusual is these columns are intentionally shaped to look like papyrus. That's great, right? So that gives you, papyrus is very well known, not just for paper, but also for boats, for reeds, for writing. It was an extremely important source of technology for the Egyptians, so much so that they built these columns to look like papyrus stalks. So if you look here on the right, you can see what they would have looked like painted, right? They're papyrus, so they should be green. They're a plant. And this gives you an idea of how these columns would have looked in ancient times. Now what I want to do is step back and look at what the overall complex would have looked like. So look at the pillars. Now watch. Okay, now you see these are those same papyrus columns that we're looking at, right? So that gives you an idea of the size just by looking here in this complex. So I want you to focus right here. And now look how big this expands, all right? And then you have these massive walls. And then if you look here, this is that same picture you saw from the previous slide. That's the same obelisk I pointed out before. That's the same statue I pointed out before. And then here, of course, is your walkway of the sphinxes, just like you saw on the previous slide. You can see where all the workers lived here. Could be some 4-room houses out there, right? A few of you who've been to my previous lectures will get that. I won't go into it here, but just imagine the thousands of people involved with the building and the maintenance of a complex like this. Now, we haven't gotten to etymology yet in this lecture, so I think it's time for some etymology. Now, we keep saying Luxor and Luxor, but what's great about saying Luxor and feeling so educated that we say Luxor is that's not the term that the ancient Egyptians would have used. It actually comes from Arabic. So when the Arabs first saw this temple complex, they actually thought there were castles. So in Arabic, you get from the castles, you get El Aqsor. And El Aqsor corrupted, or El Aqsor in Arabic corrupted into English becomes Luxor to us. So the word Luxor is really from after the Arab invasion of Egypt. And I took this picture. It's actually from a t-shirt. And it's kind of funny, I would pull from a t-shirt, but I want you to see what I like about the t-shirt is you can see just how everything's simply drawn out. And when you look at it from this angle, it's clear why the Arabs, when they came, would think it's a castle. It does look like a castle when you just kind of look at this this outline here. Now, getting back to our etymology, so what did the ancient Egyptians call Luxor? To them, it was Ipetut. Now, Ipet just means harem. And then we can get a whole discussion about harem. But a harem really is just private quarters. So that's where the term comes from, is it means it's a ruler's private quarters. Now, we think of harem in terms of the women. and so forth, but just think of it as really the private quarters. So it's Amun's Ipit, Amun's private quarters, his harem. And the Sut, that S-U-T, just means it's southern. So it's south of Karnak. It's a southern temple complex. So Ipit Sut. Just to give you an idea of the expense of building it, I just wanted to list the amount of gold that went into this structure. So Amenhotep used 3 tons of electrum and 2.5 tons of gold to build this complex. That's, if you looked at, I looked at gold a couple days ago, it was $1,600 an ounce. So if you figure 2.5 tons at $1,600 an ounce, you come up with about $180 million just in gold. That doesn't count the electrum. By the way, if you don't know, electrum is just a mix of gold and silver, so also extremely valuable. Silver, by the way, was very valuable in ancient Egypt. There were times it was more valuable than gold even. And then there was a bunch of other jewels and other valuables like lapis lazuli and so forth. So this would have been just an amazing complex in its day. Now, before we get back to Amenhotep, I want to talk actually about his wife. So let's meet Amenhotep's wife. So this is Queen Tiye, and you have this wonderful bust of her. It really gives you a feeling for what she would have looked like in life. Now, all indications are Amenhotep really loved his wife. In fact, he loved her so much, he built a lake for her in her hometown that was 1 mile long. So if you're looking for a gift for your wife, for your next anniversary, you can think about building her a lake and try to outdo Amenhotep. Couple interesting things about Queen Tiye. She technically was a commoner. Now, probably not 100% commoner. The general feeling was her father was a wealthy commoner, a guy who just made good, a rich landowner, versus her mother, who probably was a member of the extended royal family. Maybe her mother was a first cousin of a pharaoh or something like that. They probably had some royal connection. So technically she's half commoner because of her father. I mean, wealthy. I put wealthy commoner because of her father, but she was probably really like half royal. She would get married young, age 11 or 12. She's already married. What she illustrates is the advantage of widening the gene pool. So as we've seen over and over again, these pharaohs, the brothers marry their sisters. They can make it a generation or two, each maybe having a kid or 2 kids, and then eventually this keeps happening until the family's wiped out. They're just completely infertile due to this repeated incest. So by expanding his gene pool a little bit, Amenhotep was able to have many more children by his great wife. So there's a little bit of debate whether they had 6 or 7 kids, but it seems they had 4 girls and 2 or 3 boys. So we're going to think about the last few pharaohs. They have either like they have 0 sons with their great wife, or maybe 1 if they're lucky. So you see the difference. Now, she, although she did marry young, she'd become a powerful figure at court. In fact, her power would outlast her husband, Amenhotep. She would outlive him by about 12 years. And we're going to come back to that when we get to her son, because there's probably a very direct connection between what her son's actions are and how much longer she lived past her husband and into her son's reign. Not only that, I should mention her family became very powerful. Her brother was named the 2nd prophet of Amun. I'm going to get back to that in just a minute. But remember, Amun is the wealthiest, the most powerful temple, and Amenhotep's pouring all this money into it. And his brother-in-law, Tiye's brother, is going to be the 2nd prophet of Amun. And her other brother, and this is not 100%, but widely believed, her other brother was who became not only a powerful vizier in the next generations, but he would become pharaoh himself, which we'll cover on that in the next lecture. Now, Tiye's parents, though, take us to another topic, and that is, I said, I want to talk about the new kingdom, particularly this part of the new kingdom, as being the pinnacle of mummification. And it's considered that really, if you had to pick the best preserved mummies, at least one family of the best preserved mummies, you're probably looking at Tiye and her parents. specifically her father. Her father's probably number one, and then you take her and her mother. Now, we'll talk about her father for a second. Remember, I said he was a wealthy landowner. Once his daughter married the pharaoh, he became even more powerful. He was named a priest of men, which was a very, even at this time, a very ancient god in Egyptian lore, probably going back to the pre-dynastic period. He militarily was promoted to commander of the territory, and then her mother was also a religious figure, dancer of a moon, which kind of sounds like a striptease, but was not. Actually was a honorable position within the temple complex, and she also held other religious positions as well. And she was upgraded the title of Mother of the Great Royal Wife once her daughter Tiye married Amenhotep. Now, we're going to look at some mummies. Some people are squeamish, so all the mummies are on the same slide this time. So I'm going to get it out all at once, but you've got to see this family. It's really amazing. Okay. All right. So I've got 3 mummies for you to look at. This is Tiye right here. So this bust, that's her. Okay. And then this is her father. And the preservation room is amazing. I mean, like, you could really see what the guy would have looked like walking down the street. It's just unbelievable. And then this is her mother, maybe in third place of the 3, but still very well preserved. You really can get an impression of what she looked like as well. Now, there's little things too, like I like the nose here. You see this little nook in the nose for Yuya, for Tiye's father, and then you look, she has the same little nook here in her nose. I'll tell you what, let's do a little bit more etymology before we move on. I've got one more slide, one more little box I want to show you. I'll get rid of the mummies. So let's talk about mummies. Why do we say mummies? So mummification is a drying out process. If you say something's mummified now, that's a synonym with something that's dried out, but that's not really where the word comes from. The word mummy actually comes from, we have another Arabic term, mamiya, which means bitumen. So bitumen is the natural, it's really a petroleum product. So it's a natural, really thick, oily product that was used as a sealant in ancient times, like for boats. So the word mummification actually comes from that mamiya, which whether it's actually from bitumen or the more common interpretation is just like this gooey black material. So the embalming resins were this gooey black material that kind of looked like bitumen. So it may be based really more on that than bitumen itself, or it could be because the mummy's just black. The skin turns black when they're mummified, as you just saw in the previous slides. But anyway, that's where we get the term mummy. Everyone would always think mummy comes from drying out, or a dead body, but really it's just from the resins of the mummification process. It has nothing to do with drying out, even though our terms today use it as such. All right, now I want to switch back to Amenhotep III. So we've been talking about his building, we've been talking about his statues, we've been talking about his wife and his wife's family. Let's get back to the man himself. Here is another great statue. This is just like we got a really good idea from that bust of what Queen Tiye would have looked like. This gives you a great feel for what Amenhotep looked like. And something to point out here, if you look at the structure of the face here, and of course this is idealized, remember this is idealized, but if you look at the structure of the face here versus the structure here, there's definitely some similarity. You got the big ears, you've got this angular, like triangle type shape. Now remember, he was probably younger when this was taken, so your face fills out a little bit as you get older, but this is considered what's probably a good likeness of him. The other big hint is right here, his gut. Why? Because if you look at all the pharaohs, they always have these idealized bodies, like they all look like Olympic athletes. This one's a little bit pudgy, like, he's got a little bit of a stomach forming, no more huge pecs. So this is probably a pretty good likeness of what he was. So let's talk about some things that he did. Amenhotep did a lot in his 30 years. and I want to cover a little bit of it because I think it's instructive. So first of all, he's going to move his residence from Memphis to Thebes. I wouldn't get too worked up whether the court is in Memphis or Thebes at any given time. In fact, a lot of the pharaohs just kind of traveled around. I mean, they would have an official capital, but they would travel around to see their people. But there was a reason for this, which we'll get to in 1 second. Now he also built a new temple complex, which that was the pictures I showed you, the Ipitsit or Luxor. So he built this new temple complex, and then he made his brother-in-law, this is Tiye's brother, made him second prophet of Amun, and then Amun-Re becomes represented by Aten. What's going on here? What are all these? Why all these changes? What he's trying to do is strengthen himself vis-a-vis the priests. So the priesthood, particularly the priesthood of Amun, had become extremely powerful, and he's trying to overtake the power of this bureaucracy. And the hints are as follows: Karnak, right? That's the setting of Amun's priesthood. So he's going to build a new temple complex nearby, so it's not offensive, but at the same time, it's kind of starting from scratch. He's going to name his brother-in-law as the second prophet of Amun. Why not the first prophet? The second prophet of Amun, actually, the second prophet in any of these temples is the guy that controls the treasury. So I just said that Amun had the most powerful, the most wealthy of the temple complexes, temple priesthoods. And so now this brother-in-law, this creature of Amenhotep, is going to be controlling the temple treasury. What's going on here with this change from Amun-Re to Aten? Again, if you have a new god, Aten, remember I mentioned Amenhotep II, it was probably under him it was created. Here's another picture of Aten right here to remind you. So with the creation of Aten, with the rise of Aten, it also means you have to have a new class of priests, a new crop of priests that Amenhotep could then nominate people that are loyal to him. In his last 10 years, he really self-identified with Aten to emphasize this difference. Now, moving on to so that's really kind of what he's doing domestically. Let's talk about what he's doing internationally. We have in the Near Eastern world, he's got a problem. And his problem here is he's always afraid of fighting, be it with the Hittites, be it with the Mitannis, be it with the Assyrians coming over. He wants a buffer between Egypt and these other superpowers, so to speak. So what he does is he wants to control Canaan. Well, controlling Canaan is not such an easy step because just like Israel is very difficult today, you know, times won't change. It's very difficult then too. So he comes up with a plan to deal with Canaan by breaking it up into 3 different precincts. So you see here, I put the labels of each one. I don't think you necessarily need a map of it, but just know that there was an Egyptian governor at Gaza and Canaan. There was a governor at Kumidu, which is Lebanon. And then also in Syria, he had one as well, going all the way up to the border of modern Turkey almost. He also set up a major trade network. And I've mentioned in a couple of previous lectures, the trade in the ancient world was well beyond what most people realize. But I wanted to take a look at this trade, and that's going to be, we're going to take a closer look at that in 1 second. You see here circled in red are the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters are going to be a big topic for us towards the end of this lecture. But let's take a look at this trade before we move on. Okay, so this gives you, from the previous slide, this is just a zoomed in view of that same map. If I was going too fast, I left this information still here, but I really want to look at the map so you can see how much movement and what was being moved going on here. Now, looking at this map right here tells you why Nubia was always so important to the pharaohs. Look at how much gold is in this limited space. So the pharaohs were not trying to control Nubia for sightseeing. They were trying to control Nubia for gold. But if you look here at these arrows showing you the red arrows showing you the trade, you can see how widely dispersed copper was, a very important metal. But what the Egyptians wanted to do was create bronze, and for bronze you need tin. Their tin actually had to come from Afghanistan. It's amazing, you know, when you think how far, if this map continued, I'd be like over here, Afghanistan to Babylonia, Babylonia to Canaan, Canaan to Egypt, just for the Egyptians to get the tin they needed for bronze. Because by the way, bronze is about 90% copper and 10% tin, but that tin is an extremely important ingredient for the hardness. But this just shows you, I hope you had a second to look at it. This turquoise mine is what we were talking about, if you recall, in the Abraham lecture, and the invention of the Hebrew script this was what we were talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then you need to check out the Abraham lecture. You'll be interested in it. Now, I think it's time for us to move on and talk about the Amarna letters. Now, and this is an extremely important source of information for us, both in diplomacy and in Judaism. Amenhotep's Amarna letters. So what are they? First of all, you have they're tablets. They're clay tablets. For those of you who were in any of my Mesopotamia lectures or familiar with Mesopotamia, you know the cuneiform tablets, where you have these mud brick tablets that have these little tick marks in them, and those tick marks form a written language called cuneiform. Cuneiform, and the writing and the language that they were representing was Akkadian, which is a Semitic language. Hebrew and Akkadian and Arabic are all cousins, Aramaic as well. But anyway, the Akkadian was the international language, so I think it's important to note that Egyptian was not, and hieroglyphs were limited to Egypt. If you were dealing in diplomacy, it was in cuneiform, written in Akkadian at this point in time. So we have these 380 tablets that were found in Tel Amarna, which I will get to a lot more in the next lecture. So we're going to talk a lot more about how our Amarna came to be then. But right, for this lecture's purpose, just know that there was this cache of almost 400 diplomatic documents. Now, these documents came from 6 major Near Eastern powers, along with a bunch of smaller vassal states. So here, I pulled this map back up. You saw this towards the beginning of the presentation. I just wanted you to remind yourself here. So here's what Egypt looked like at the time. This is Canaan that was split into pieces by Amenhotep. The other powers here, you have the Hittites, you have the Mitanni, you have Assyria, you have Babylonia. So these are the major powers that we're dealing with, that we're talking to each other. But really, if you look at a lot of the correspondence was much smaller states. These 6 major powers, we have a bunch of samples of the way they talk to each other, and it's great. They all refer, all these heads of a power refer to each other as brother. But if you have to summarize what they're really talking about in one sentence, it's this line right here. Basically, these other kings keep offering their daughters in exchange for Egyptian gold. They know that the Egyptians have control over all that gold in Nubia, and they're willing to give up their daughters for a piece of that gold. And there's just an incredible amount of whining, like formal diplomatic correspondence, whining about the value of the gifts that they're giving each other. But to give you an idea, this one line kind of sums it up. One of the letters to the Pharaoh says, "Gold is like sand to you; you simply gather it up." Right, so that's the way these other rulers are looking at the gold of Egypt. Now, number 2 here, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at. All right, so the Babylonian king, Kadashman-Enlil, he's repeatedly asking for this Egyptian princess. I actually referenced this without an introduction because it would have made sense at the time, but I referenced this letter in the Abraham lecture. Right, so Kadashman-Enlil of Babylon, he writes to Amenhotep, basically asking for one of Amenhotep's daughters. Right, he's asking for an Egyptian princess, and he's complaining that Amenhotep clearly wrote to him saying that since the earliest times, no daughter of the king of Egypt has ever been given in marriage. So I referenced this before, but I want to emphasize it now that I can put it in the context of what's going on. So yes, all these, the Babylonian princesses, the Hittite princesses, the Mitanni princesses, they may all come to Egypt, but the Egyptian princesses do not marry outside of the royal family. All right, now what I want to do is take a look at these smaller vassal states that are writing to the king of Egypt. Okay, so this isn't a comprehensive list, but this gives you an idea. So these are a lot of the main city-states that are writing. This is the land of Canaan that's controlled by Egypt, and these are the cities that are writing to Amenhotep for one reason or another. Now he is well. Actually, you know what? I think it's a good time to take a look at one of these, right? Okay, so here's Abimelchu, and what's different about him is he is writing to a king that he recognizes as superior. So notice he's not calling him brother, right? He's saying, to the king, my lord, I fall at your feet 7 times, and 7 times, you know, and so all he's really doing, he's talking about these ships. So clearly the Egyptians have parked some ships on in his city, and that's what he's writing about. But the topic's not important. I just want you to see how he really grovels to the Egyptian king in his letters. Now, one thing I kind of want to mention too about his control of Canaan and talking about his diplomacy, one taste we've been able to get from the Amarna letters is that he does this great plan, and it's compared to how the British handled India, right? So he cannot leave a massive amount of soldiers in the land of Canaan. And the reason he can't, which I mentioned in a couple of previous lectures, is that Egyptians believe their soil is holy. They want to be buried on their soil. So you cannot get Egyptians to want to live outside the land of Egypt for a long period of time. So an army, yeah, they'll invade, they'll go through a campaign season fighting in the land of Canaan, but they want to go back home afterwards, because if they were to be killed, they want to be buried in their own land. Only that way are they going to have an afterlife. Now, to deal with this, Amenhotep comes up with this great solution. He's gonna set up garrisons just at the port. So he didn't have this massive army, just the ports where all the ships can get in and out of it. He'll garrison. Then on 2 main avenues, he's going to have 2 inland ports. You see, I have Beit Cheyenne mentioned. Should be familiar to anyone who knows Israel. He also has these huge grain depots. So even if his garrisons were to be attacked, they could hold out long enough and have enough food to get by until the full army could get there. And then finally, what he does is he pays off the vassal states to be friendly. He just gives them gifts to stay his friend. And like I said, I read that this was like the British controlling India, and I think it's an apt comparison. Also, again, is one of those points that tells you that there's nothing new under the sun. Let's take a look at one more of this series of Amarna letters before we move on. This one is, again, another superpower writing him, right? So this is the Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit, and he's writing really to show a gesture of friendship, right? He's just trying to make friends, and they're talking about gift giving. So I want you to have this example of this gift giving, and it shows you that a lot of it is just being friendly, just international relations, and I'm sure each one is trying to get the better of what gift they get, but nonetheless, I think it's a good example. Now it's time to move on to those of you here for World History by a Jew. This is the meat. This is when we really get to the Jew part of this world history lecture, and that is going to be this subcategory of the Amarna letters. Now, the Amarna letters give us a taste of the Hobbyroo, the Hobbyroo people, and that's going to be our closing topic for tonight. Okay, so you have the word Hobbyroo, and Hobbyroo, if you break it down, sounds a lot like Hebrew. Okay, so just go with me for a minute, and I want to go through these tablets with you. Now, first of all, let me just say this is not my work. There is a website called bible.ca/archaeology by a gentleman named Steve Rudd. I can't say I agree with everything on the website, but he has done a better job presenting the Hobbyroo tablets of anyone else I've seen. So I'm going to give him full credit for that. You can actually go to his website and see more of them if you want, but I tried to get the highlights here. You may not necessarily need to after you go through this with me. But let's look at these Hobbyroo, and I want you to be thinking about Hebrew as we read these, okay? So the mayor of Jerusalem writes to the king Pharaoh that they are now attempting to take Jerusalem, right? That seems to be a familiar city for a lot of people. So Pharaoh has placed his name in Jerusalem forever. He cannot abandon the land of Jerusalem, Gezer, Ashkelon, right? So these are other familiar names to you, right? Here we are. They have given oil, food, and supplies to the Hobbyroo. Okay, let's look here. The mayor of Hebron, another familiar city. Only Abdi Hebron, mayor of Jerusalem, and I have been at war with the Hobbyroo. Like everyone else will let us down. You got to come help us. The mayor of Gezer, right? The Hobbyroo are stronger than we. Send help and save me from the Hobbyroo, lest the Hobbyroo destroy us. From the mayor of Gezer, right? Save your land from the power of the Hobbyroo. Mayor of Megiddo, another familiar one. We just talked about the Battle of Megiddo in the previous lecture. The mayor of Shechem, and I have given to the Hobbyroo, given money to the Hobbyroo and the Sudians. They waged war against me. So these are great examples. Now let's really analyze the question here at the top. The question is, does Hobbyroo equal Hebrew? So let's take a closer look. Okay, the previous slide was, these were the tablets, okay? And by the way, that EA just means El Amarna, which tells you where it's from. So it was found in Amarna, those documents. So each one is individually numbered. So these right here are the numbers that I had on the previous slide. So it'll stop you from having to rewind. But what I really want you to see is overall where all these tablets are. If you look, I'm sorry, where all these, let me clarify that. All the tablets are in Amarna in Egypt here at this, where you see Akhenaten, that's where they were found. These are the locations that are described in the tablets. So this Piogal on Wikimedia has done this amazing job of mapping out all the cities that are mentioned in the Hobbyroo Amarna tablets. And you can see the main area of activity is the land of Canaan. But you can see that also the Hittites are dealing with it, the Mitanni's dealing with it, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and of course the Egyptians, since that's our topic. They are the geography sounds, if you're trying to find Hebrews and you look at the word Hobbyroo and then look at the geography, this is looking very interesting to you. That's the point. Now let me move to the next slide for a little bit more detail here. So the Hobbyroo, and by the way, you see Apiroo and Hobbyroo. Let me explain. The Hobbyroo is actually comes from a guttural type sound. So that's translated into Egyptian with the ah sound. They don't have that guttural, that ha. So it's Apiroo for the Egyptians. It's Hobbyroo if you're talking about someone who speaks a Semitic language. Now, there you have a, and by the way, that's with an ayin. That's not with a hey. For those who speak Hebrew, I should emphasize that ayin, we think of aleph and ayin today as being silent. Both aleph and ayin once had a sound. Aleph's was probably very soft to us, may even have been undetectable to us. There was a more pronounced guttural sound to ayin. So that's the basis of this Hobbyroo, right? So it wasn't ha, it was like this Hobbyroo. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in the next lecture, and we're actually going to look at the Hebrew and how that connects. But anyway, what I want you to understand is these Hobbyroo were a group of people that were identifiable by that name. All these countries, all these city-states clearly knew what Hobbyroo people were when they were named. Okay, that's important. If you look at their area of activity, and these are the modern countries, but this is where the Hobbyroo were in modern terms: Egypt, Turkey, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. And there are hundreds of references in these places. Okay, so the geography really, really works for us, as I mentioned from the map of the previous slide. And of course, the center of all of this is the land of Canaan. And when we think of the Hebrew people, where do they come from? They came from the land of Canaan. Now, I want to look at the dating. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that, the list of dates in the previous slide or in the beginning, but if you take Abraham, his birth and his activity, you're looking at around 1800 BCE as with rabbinical dating, and then you go all the way to Moses. Then we're going to be hitting around, you know, the early 1200s BCE. There's basically the 600-year period of history that we've got from Abraham through Moses. Now, when you look at the Hobbyroo, what is the period of time they're being talked about? From 1800 BCE to 1200 BCE. So it's the same period of time. Now, here's where it gets a little bit sticky. They were a lower caste of people. They were not an ethnic group, okay? So for example, look at the next line. When you have Hobbyroo's names recorded, and there have been lists of their names recorded, the majority of their names are Semitic names. And think about it, for Jews, it needs to be a Semitic name. We're looking at Semites, really, to make that connection. But they were not all Semites. You could tell by the names they were not Semites. So let me give you an example. A very well-known name today is Netanyahu, right? So Netanyahu has that Yahu, which is a connection to Hashem, to God. And then you have the Netanel, which is like a gift. So like a gift of God. This is a similar idea that you'd see for all the Semitic names. They were not all like that, but the majority of them were Semitic names. So they were this lower caste of people. They were definitely looked down upon. There was always a negative connotation. They were slaves, maybe they were escaped slaves, maybe they were captured slaves. They were servants. They could be robbers. They could be mercenaries. They could just be agriculturalists or laborers. It wasn't like it certainly was not a compliment to be called a Hebrew now, or a Hobbyroo. But let's look at what ties this all together. The etymology. Well, clearly, Hobbyroo and Hebrew are close. Particularly when we look at the Hebrew, you'll see you'll see it written in the Hebrew in the next lecture. When you look at the chronology, the dates match wonderfully. And then look at the proximity. Okay, so the proximity is if you look at the map here, right? So the proximity works as well for the Hebrews. So then that takes us back to our question that started this section. Does Hobbyroo equal Hebrew? So come back for part 2 and have much more on this, but that's not it. We have monotheism in Egypt. We have the real Joseph, or at least a Joseph prototype. We have King Tut. We have Nefertiti. There's a lot more. So if you want to see more of the art, I've got another of these like little run-throughs of what the art looks like. We're going to talk about monotheism. Was monotheism an Egyptian or a Jewish invention? Always a nice controversial topic. We're going to talk about this real Joseph. We'll talk about Nefertiti, who's the most famous queen of Egypt. Maybe Cleopatra could be, but Cleopatra was really a pharaoh, not a queen. So if you're talking about queens, Nefertiti's got to be everyone's number one. Then we're going to look at King Tut as a person. We looked at him as an archaeological find, but next time we're going to talk to him as a person and run us right up to the line starting Exodus. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in a week or so. Any questions?